Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining ABC for this is now our fifth in our S.O.S series webinars in terms of focusing on today on the Black worker in light of COVID-19, but also in light of certainly the current events in our society as it relates to the death of George Floyd. Want to just give you very briefly in terms of who we are, in terms of why this is important for Associated Black Charities. For us, it is about closing the racial wealth gap in Baltimore and the Baltimore metropolitan area. We're clear that unless we're able to address the issue of structural racism embedded in lots of the system that makes up moving Black workers and workers of color forward, we're not going to be able to make that difference. And it was astounding to know that, in fact, if we were able to just to move a Black family income worker to actually moving it up to $60,000 in terms of the Baltimore area, it would make a substantial difference in closing the racial wealth gap. And so this conversation today is really critically important to have you join us in the conversation. And I'm excited in terms of to introduce our panelists today and then just to give you a few housekeeping tasks. I want to first, in terms of thank all the panelists for joining us and give an introduction. And certainly as we go to the questions for the panelists, if you want to add more about your particular role, please feel free to do so, because you all are so outstanding in your own particular spheres of influence, and what you do, I could never do you justice. But I do want to thank, in terms of Jimmy Britton, to being with us today, and Jimmy is the founder and president of Class Act Catering. I want to thank Laura Gamble, who is the regional president of Mid-Region for PNC. I want to thank, in terms of Laura Geissler, who is the director for the Leadership Institute for LifeBridge Health, and Thomas Penny III, president of Donahoe Hospitality Services. Thank you all for being with us today. And to our audience, I just want to share with you in terms of please use the chat area for your questions. In terms of if you have a question, I also ask to make sure that we want to make sure you get an opportunity to hear all of our panelists first. And so I ask you to write down your question if something comes up as our panelists are responding to the questions. We absolutely will make time for you to have an opportunity to share your question, and to any particular panelists or to all of them. But I would also say to each of you in terms of joining us today that because I know all four panelists, I know that you're in for a treat in terms of this conversation and what they bring to this conversation in terms of not only today, but what they're doing in terms of our everyday worlds. And so with that, I am going to begin in terms of the questions. And I'm going to just begin by, you know what, Thomas, I'm going to begin with you. Because as we began to plan for this today, you actually talked about framing this conversation in terms of in light of both COVID-19 and the confluence of the issue of George Floyd's death and what that means in terms of space. And so I would want to know, how do you see businesses starting to respond, and how do you think they will respond as more businesses open up in light as it relates to the Black worker and workers of color?
So thank you, Diane, and thank you for the invitation. First, I would say I'm going to speak first on the COVID side, and then I'm going to address the George Floyd part of the equation. From a COVID-19 perspective, I think the one thing that was most important for us in service to our team members as well as our guests is a great deal of confidence that we were clean and we were safe and secure. And so what we had to do is, one, make certain we had PPE available for our associates to maintain their safety, as well as we had to mandate that those entering our hotels and restaurants were wearing PPE. In addition to that, we have had to integrate a great deal of technology. Before, in the hotel world, you didn't want to see folks walking around cleaning. You just wanted them to be invisible. However, now you want them to be visible. You want to see that all touch surfaces are being cleaned with hospital-grade disinfectants. We're investing in electrostatic sprayers to really give a sense of security to our associates and our team, that our buildings are safe and secure. But I would also say, just in terms of the psychological impact of COVID, we really had to spend more time talking to our team and giving them the flexibility to either come to work or not come to work based upon them being shut in with kids, with transportation being impaired, we almost needed to look at every associate on a case-by-case basis, especially our associates of color, because there were some structural impediments that stood in the way of their ability to get to work. And so we needed to be sensitive to those things. And then from a George Floyd perspective, I think the pandemic already created a high level of stress within the hotel world for our associates of color. George Floyd was a psychological punch at a time when they were already down because of what they were dealing with. And what George Floyd suggested to our associates of color is that in America in 2020, their life could be taken in a cavalier way, and that the world and many of our elected officials did not care to respond with a level of justice. And so this has been a major issue. I had to issue a statement to my team affirming that Black Lives Matter. I think it's important for executives in business to articulate as much. For me personally, I expressed a commitment to social justice. We're going to give scholarships to young people of color in the communities of where we do business that are focused in on social justice and bringing people together. I think they wanted to hear from me as the leader of our business what organizationally we were doing and what I'm doing individually to really make a contribution in the area of social justice post George Floyd. And so, again, I think we've had to make some adjustments to our business and our approach to business as a result of COVID-19, but we've had to speak specifically to our associates of color post George Floyd.
Thank you, Thomas, for that response. I do want a follow-up question before I move to another panelist, particularly the sensitivity that you referenced as an employer, particularly in the hospitality industry that you're a part of, in terms of for your associates of color. Do you believe this was an unusual sensitivity, not usual in your sector, or yes or no? Or elaborate however you choose.
I think it's unusual in the sense that there is a lack of diversity at the highest levels of hotel companies. And so there's a huge blind spot. I think for those of us who've never had an encounter with a police officer of which we found ourselves concerned about our safety, we're totally removed from the idea that this kind of thing can happen. I think because I've had those experiences, I think that it required for me not only to lean forward as a professional, but as a man of color, African American, to let them know what my direct experience was, and also to respond from a personal position as opposed to just an organizational position. And we were able to do that because of the shared experience with George Floyd.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing that. I want to get some other panelists into this conversation in terms of response. And so, Laura, Geissler, I'm going to ask you in terms of, from the employer's perspective, how can employers support vulnerable workers whose positions are seen as essential? We have this whole conversation around essential workers for the hospitality, healthcare, in terms of that, while the workers in those positions are seen as expendable and devalued in terms of their salaries, wages, and benefits. And what do you think that industries are doing to address this issue?
Well, hi, everybody. Yeah, I have to say that in the wake of COVID here, and that continues, that it's really been great to see so many of our frontline workers who haven't kind of previously been highlighted as essential by the public, getting really much deserved praise and recognition. We've always known at LifeBridge that, how important and valuable these team members are to us being able to care bravely and take great care of our patients and our communities. Often we get really nice letters to our hospital presidents from patients and families that are grateful for the care that they've gotten. And it's really great to see them recounting instances with team members from potentially housekeeping or food services that either cleaned their room or delivered a meal there that really made a connection with those patients and family members. And it really turned around, and created a great experience for them. So we've always known that these workers are absolutely essential and valued. As far as salaries and wages go, these are determined by market analysis data. And they're reviewed annually by the organization. And we use industry types of data analysis, Maryland Hospital Association, American Hospital Association types of data to set those salary or determine those salary rates. And obviously each job has certain skill requirements, competency requirements, and also the demand for workers in those roles and in those areas. It will be interesting to see if there's a shift kind of post-COVID around some of that market data. That remains yet to be seen. You know, as far as benefits go, I would tell you that LifeBridge offers a great benefit package to really all of our associates. And one of the really neat things that we do is we have tiered cost sharing that makes these benefits more affordable to employees at certain salary levels. So, you know, that's just some of the things that we've done to try to adjust cost sharing and things of that nature to help our workers who are at a lower level in salary.
Laura, I'm going to expand upon that question for you a little bit. You may not be able to answer, so I'll tell you that now. But I wonder what would happen in terms of its MHA now, because I haven't been on the board, begins to talk about the role of racial equity in terms of in place of for hospitals and for to look at that. I wonder if racial equity was used as a framework and that whole setting of rates in terms of for those workers, what might that look, how that could look different in terms of the question talking about changing kind of the value of those workers with a racial equity framework?
Actually, Diane, that's a great question. And I can take a little bit of a crack at it here just because I'm pleased to sit on a newly formed, actually, really just in the fall of last year, an MHA diversity, inclusion and equity task force that brings together people from all around the healthcare system across Maryland into the room. So I'm there with some of my colleagues from Hopkins and larger and MedStar and larger facilities to some of the smaller, more community-based hospitals. We all come together and we are talking about how are we inside of our institutions and our systems working at diversity, inclusion, and equity. And right now, I can tell you that there's actually a proposal that's being put forward to all of leadership of the hospitals to do just what it is that you're talking about, to look at how can we frame this and how can we change the dialogue around this for the future. So there is work underway around it. So my hope is that it continues to move forward in a really positive direction.
That's good to hear in terms of moving out essential workers that have not necessarily been valued the same way. That certainly would be a game changer, adding an equity framework to that whole valuation in terms of that. So Laura, I'm going to turn to you, Laura Gamble. I'm going to have to call full names with both Lauras. Thank you. In terms of, I'm actually going to ask you the same question in terms of, from your landscape, how can employers support vulnerable workers whose positions are seen as essential while the workers in those positions are seen as expendable and devalued? How would you respond to that in terms of what do you see the industry doing to address that issue?
Well, obviously, as in financial services, we're considered essential. And for us during the pandemic, it's really been about balancing the health and safety of our employees with the needs of our customers. We obviously don't have the ability to send everybody home and work from home because we have, customers that we need to interface with that only can interface with us in person. So it's really been about facilities changes, changes to schedules. We've really tried to protect people, our employees, the best we can from interfacing consistently with the public. So we basically cycle people in and out on 2-week cohorts, and basically are just having people at home for 2 weeks and then coming in for 2 weeks. And we've made pay adjustments for that as well to supplement our frontline employees. So it's really been trying to give our customers access while protecting our employees the best way we can. And in terms of what does that mean going forward? I think frankly, I have done that job of being a branch employee, and it's one of the toughest jobs you will find in our company. And I think much like the healthcare worker, I mean, that you tend to get the greatest compliments to people who handle very difficult situations very well, but you never know who you're going to be interfacing with. You interface with all stratas of society, and it takes a lot of skill to be able to do that. So I would never say that our frontline employees are undervalued, because those are, it takes a lot of skill to deal with the general public. But in what we can do, and we do it, and we're continuing to do it even through the pandemic, is invest in our employees in skill building and giving them the opportunity to see career pathways, if they so desire, to move throughout the company. And we really do have a very dedicated focus to hiring from within, and making sure that we are supporting our employees of color and our African American employees especially. We've got to focus on how we can continue to make sure that those employees have an opportunity to move throughout the company.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Jimmy, in your particular line of work, particularly, I want you to share with us in terms of how COVID-19, all of the confluence of the response in terms of George Floyd's death has impacted your industry and your business particularly, and how does that impact in terms of your essential workers, and what do you see going forward?
So I think that we take this time, currently, we are doing some things in terms of our essential workers, just bringing them up to speed as to how we pivot because of the closures of business, and we're doing some new training, and we're trying to look at some new ways and ideas to reboot through this process. We're especially excited about how we've been able to do that. We've come up with some new concepts and some new ideas, and we went back to the beginnings. We are doing more curbside dinners. We're just doing different things, individual things, more people eating at home. So we've had to change our whole business concept because of this pandemic. Most of our contracts that we had were food service oriented, where we had institutions and institutional feedings, colleges, and all that was shut down. So we had to lay off practically everyone. And then we came back to the table and said, we need to come up with some new concepts and ideas. And so we began looking at different approaches. We began looking at sensitivity things with, how are people going to come back to work, and what are they going to be expecting? How are they going to, just get their lives back in order? And I'll tell you, it's been a difficult task, but we're doing everything as a company to bring them back gradually. We brought all of our essential workers back. And now we're reaching out to some of the programs that the state and other agencies has that are doing special feeding. And so we're bringing the workers back on those programs.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. So a little bit to this, I'm going to toss this out to anyone because Jimmy started talking about that. But what does it mean to retrain or repurpose jobs so that vulnerable workers won't be abandoned? How have you, if any of you else had that experience in terms of retrain, repurpose jobs, as Jimmy was just describing?
So in the hotel space, for example, typically this time of the year, occupancies are in the 85 to 95% range. Right now, we're seeing occupancies between 10 to 30%. So as a consequence, there's a large number of our team members that we really don't have work for. But we're fortunate in that we have 5 hotels that will open in the next 9 months. And so we're actually repurposing some of our existing associates at hotels where we just don't have enough business. We're repurposing them to our new hotels in lieu of hiring new associates from the outside. We're basically repurposing existing employees to the new hotels such that they can maintain employment through this time. And Diane, just to go back to your equity question, I also just think it's important for us to highlight, while we have millennials demanding change in the streets of urban America, we also have millennials demanding change from an equity perspective within our respective organizations. And so millennials don't want to wait. They feel that we have been too patient. And just as they're demanding change in the streets, they're also demanding changes within our organizations such that they can see themselves at the highest levels. And so I'm actually encouraged by what we're seeing by way of millennials and in terms of them asserting a level of urgency around change.
Thank you for that. So the other question I want to go to in terms of just to see who wants to take this in terms of what are some universal core competencies or proficiencies that will add value to any job that are transferable? I think about that in terms of, are there some common denominators in terms of, or in terms of taking a job vertical? I wonder about that particular, thank you, Lord Geissler, in terms of healthcare.
Yeah, well, you got some biggies here, which are kind of the price of admission, and they're going to continue to stay the price of admission to work in healthcare. And I'm sure Laura Campbell will talk about that, and Thomas and Jimmy as well. But service excellence, when I think of competencies, empathy and compassion, you know, right now we're in a situation where people are doing probably a little more technology and telehealth, right? But they still want that human touch, and they still want that empathy and compassion. So those things are just critical. Emotional intelligence, again, price of admission, right? Collaboration and being a team player. Compliance, obviously, with safety, guidelines and regulations, and those things are changing sometimes day to day, you know, week to week as COVID continues to go on here. Obviously, technical, clinical excellence, those skills have to be there, right? We can train around some of those things. All of the things I've mentioned, we can train around. But those are core competencies. I would say agility, accountability, creating and maintaining respectful relationships, time management, organization skills. So those, to me, I know that's a mouthful I just gave you, but I think all of those things are really important. They were in the past, but some of them are even more amplified now.
Thank you. Laura, do you want to take that as well in terms of?
Yeah, thanks, Diane. I tell anyone who is interested in banking that really, if you can communicate in person and in writing and think critically, we can teach you everything else. So those are really the predominant skills in any of our lines of businesses that you really need to have to be able to work for us. And then I would layer on top of that, obviously, we have our corporate values and what we call I lead, which are our leadership skills. And really it's about treating people respectfully, leading inclusively and intentionally, and you know, those types of values that we expect someone to have in the company. But you know, essentially, if you have the analytical skill and the ability to communicate, we can teach everything else.
Okay, thank you. So I want to go back, Thomas, to a point you made earlier in terms of just around seeing the difference in terms of millennials in the workplace, in terms of what they're demanding or what they want to see in terms of equity, in terms of that. I think the other point I would be remiss in not mentioning in terms of, we also see in terms of, as we've paid attention to that, there is also baby boomers who are asking the same questions. I think the wonderful part about wonderful in the sense of seeing lots of the conversation and the movement that's always been there in our country is this intergenerational, that they're coming together, that we're all clear that that has to be different in terms of the equity space. And I think that as we look back, Adar would probably say this in terms of history, in terms of looking back of the history of being clear about that, moving that forward. It is really an intergenerational, and it's so pivotal to hear the younger voices join that. So it's not just the baby, it's all of us in terms of the baby boomers, the millennials, and all coming together in terms of it, clearly one voice on the importance of equity. I want to go to a question in terms of, I think it's a question coming from the panelists in terms of this. $15 an hour even is still barely making it wages, which is why we talk about positions being essentials and workers being disposable. And that was it in terms of how do we frame that, understanding that that's $15 an hour is not necessarily moving someone to a level of supporting their family. How do we adjust that? How do we have that conversation? with an essential worker?
I can take it, or
Okay. Go ahead, Thomas.
yeah. So I think that in any of our respective industries, it's going to be really, really important that folks find a pathway forward, not just a job, not just the first opportunity, but they see the road for progress. In our hotels today, while all of them pay above $15 an hour, even if it's $18 or $19 an hour, that is not something that someone wants to continue to make for 10 or 15 or 20 years. And so I think we got to present to them the pathway forward such that they can see a ladder of which they can move upward in. And so I think that's really important. And just, Diane, just one thing that you had touched on just a few seconds ago in reference to, you know, the things that folks are going to need to be successful. I would just add authenticity and adaptability to what my fellow panelists have added. You know, the people in Baltimore are uniquely positioned in that they have survival skills. They've survived some difficult situations. In all of our industries, this is a difficult time. And for those who've had personal experience in dealing with difficult situations, they have some unique skills to bring to bear at this critical moment. And so I think organizationally, we need to create the landscape where we invite them to be a part of the thought partnership, if you will, in helping to advance our organizations forward. And if they can rely on that past experience, they can bring something tangible to the table as we look to get ourselves out of this present situation.
Thank you. Thank you for that. Jimmy, you want to add anything in that conversation? I can go into another question in terms of, Jimmy, you want to add anything to that?
No, I'm listening.
Okay. So I guess the other question in terms of where we are right now, in terms of what opportunities are there for both workers and for employers in this new space and new way of doing business? All of you have talked about in some way or another. Some of you started this conversation, started answering this in terms of talking about the hospitality industry in terms of what you're doing different. What are some of the things in terms of that you've learned through the COVID-19 and kind of different ways of doing businesses? And is there a greater opportunity for workers and employers in this new spaces to do more on behalf of the Black workers of color?
Well, I can certainly address, we can certainly do more in terms of motivating our current employees to always seek, as some of our panelists have said, to do better. And they're looking to do better. The new millenniums, as we talked about, they're excited about not just being that same $15 an hour employee or that $12 an hour employee. They are just aggressive in saying that we want to become business owners. We want to become executives. We want to be in a better position. We just don't want to be that same worker who stays in the same position. So they're looking for, you know, and they've got to have their work cut out for them as well. They just can't be giving it to them. So I find that a lot of times, as aggressive as the new millennials are, we've got to teach them to be aggressive and to work harder. They just can't be handed out a new salary because they desire it. They've got to earn it. So we just can't say that we're going to give an employee $15, $18, $20 an hour. We've got to teach them what to do with that 15, 18, or 20. We've got to make sure that as we give them raises and as we give them new positions, they have the information to go with it.
Thank you, Jimmy. What I think the other part of that conversation has to also be, we often talk about this in terms of this may be a tough conversation as all of you in terms of employers, and that we also acknowledge that in the space of business environment, that there are policies and practices that also can be limiting for workers of color and for Black workers. In terms of, so the question is, what can you do, what can we do as employers in terms of paying attention to those kind of environmental policies and practices that sometimes are not visible in terms of to everyone, and how they can be limiting for Black workers and people of color? And those, how do we address that? And are industries prepared to begin to look at themselves?
So Diane, I would say, oh, you can go ahead, Laura, I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. Go ahead, Thomas.
Diana, I would say for the first time in my 28 years of being in the hotel business and just being in business, period, have I heard a chorus of folks speak to the issue of race, injustice, and the need for change. So the good news is, in the first time in my 28 years, I'm hearing a chorus of words. I think what we have to do is make certain that we get beyond words to deeds. And I think we have to be demanding in our expectations that structural systems, for example, if there's a requirement for a college degree, but it's not necessary, we need to take that off the table. If there's a bias towards returning citizens transitioning to work, we need to take that off the table if it's not something that is important. There's all these barriers that prevent folks of color from not only getting a job, but advancing in it. And I think now that we have the attention of the business community, we have to demand structural changes. And I think now is the time that we really lean forward in a compelling way and make those demands. If we don't do it now, 6 months from now, a year from now, it'll be too late. This is the moment of which we have to lean into it. And I'm encouraged that the opportunity is here and now, and there's folks that are really trying to make some significant change. But I'm also cautious in that if we're not careful, folks can let this moment pass.
I agree with Thomas. I don't know that in my 35+ year career, I have ever heard so many mentions of structural racism in corporate America. And from my own CEO, I frankly wasn't even aware he understood the term until recently. And, but I think, we have a renewed emphasis, not just on, external economic justice, but internally within the company. What are the policies? What are the procedures that are delivering disparate outcomes in terms of retention and promotion of African Americans within the company? And really, to Tom's point, we really structurally are looking at, what are, do you need a college degree? Do you need transportation for that job? What are the things that have just been in the job application form for years and years that nobody ever really thought of, but was delivering a disparate outcome?
Thank you.
Diane, just one other thing, because businesses were the recipients, many businesses were the recipients of PPP funding, that put us in a position of having a relationship with our friends on the Hill. And we have members of the Congressional Black Caucus that have chair positions of major committees and subcommittees. Now they're in a position to ask organizations and industries, what are they doing in the areas of diversity and in the areas of removing these barriers such that folks can see a clear path forward. And so, granted, we needed the funding, but now we have a responsibility to report against how we're doing as it relates to the diversity within our organizations and industries. And I would just, say to my friends up on the Hill, lean into it and hold us accountable, because you've provided some support we needed, and we have some accountability now.
I think that's a very important point, but also to both you and Laura's point, the question goes to any of you in terms of, there's a lot of chatter in the social media right now in terms of this particular time we're in, both in terms of the impact of COVID-19 and what it exposed, particularly in terms of for workers of color and essential workers, and then also the follow-up in terms of the George Floyd's death and then the follow-up protest of that. And so there's been this huge groundswell of responses from corporate America, including PNC, Laura, in terms of that. I don't know if LifeBridge put out a statement, but the question is that I hear in social media, it's a question that we raise is, so tell us what's happening beyond the statements. And I think a number of the public, particularly the public workers of color and Black workers, are really asking that question. Like, hey, your statement's great. It's great about putting the money out there, but we also understand historically that can be a flash and disappear. And so the question is, what's going on inside of those companies to bring about some really structural changes. You began to address some of that, Laura, in terms of PNC. Thomas, earlier, and I don't know if this was an earlier comment you made while we were in the panel, but what does the boardroom look like in terms of you think about the decisions being made? What do those look like? What are those decisions made in terms of that move forward? How are workers of color engaged in that? But are they integrated in terms of throughout the organization? Looking at the policies is certainly a great place in terms of, Laura, you made the point, is data a part of your analysis? Because if you don't have data, how do you know what the impact is disproportionately for workers of color? So how should companies that have put out the great statements, how should companies look at themselves, and how do we hold companies accountable for those public statements?
So,
Well, I want, sorry, Thomas, you go ahead.
no, please.
I will say that I cringed a little bit when we put our statement out last week, because I felt like, you know, it looks like we're just one of many with the PR statement. But I will say that in terms of promotion, retention, and recruitment improvement of African Americans in particular, and not just, and as well as other people of color, but really a focus on African Americans, started in our company earlier this year when we brought all our leaders, our African American leaders, together to talk about why weren't we doing a better job at this and what did we need to do. So we did start this work before George Floyd's unfortunate death, but you know, we issued the press release with everybody else about our focus on ending systemic racism and promoting economic empowerment and economic and social justice. So I'm afraid that we look like we're just in with that whole group of people who just wanted to check the box, and that it was a little bit of an issue for me when we did that. But I think, you know, it is incumbent upon us to look internally first. I think we are concerned about the community and what can we as a bank do to really change external structures and systems. But first we gotta take care of our own people and work internally, while also promoting economic empowerment and things in the community. But I was going to say that it really does start with the board in a public company. The board is really the entity that we have to answer to. And I would tell you, in our case, our board is pushing us to do these things, and is really the first time that I can say in corporate America willing for us to take a little hit in terms of revenue and profit to do the right thing here. And I don't know of many other entities in the public company sphere that have said that.
3 months from now, 6 months from now, who holds accountability for the report card saying that you're actually doing what you say you're going to be doing? Because it's been my experience that we have these conversations, that we all check the box, like you mentioned, and then it goes away. And then, you know, all of the diversity programs that I've seen, I've yet to see a report that says this is what we've actually done in terms of elevating Blacks to executive positions. So we've got to have somebody that has you can call it what you want. You can call it the George Floyd's report card. And 6 months from now, we can say that as a result of X, Y, and Z, here's the stats, the real stats, not the made up stats.
Absolutely. I think that's an important point about Thomas raised earlier in terms of accountability on the Hill, accountability in Annapolis, accountability in any of our local governments, in terms of it must be in terms of accountability, in terms of around the promises and how does that get embedded inside of the organization. Laura, I love your point in terms of, because I don't think many people know, and I think maybe corporations don't understand the need to be more visible about what they're doing inside the organization. I understand the issue of brand risk, but I think that's an important part of the conversation. But I think another question I'm going to raise here, though, around changing boardrooms, again, both Thomas and Laura, in terms of that, is how do we make sure that even as you put, as more people of color, as a corporation or business is now willing to do that, but we also want to make sure we found in terms of, and I'll talk probably more on the nonprofit, but I think it's in the for-profit world, is that people of color sitting on your boards have the ability to risk in terms of to share their truth, to share that. There's a risk factor for people of color in terms of sitting in leadership and sitting in that. And so they're bringing that voice to the table. How does that in corporations ensure that there's a space created for that and bringing on more people of color into that governance model?
Diane, I think I personally bear significant responsibility in this regard. My father used to say, boy, it doesn't matter what you have in your yard. If your neighbor doesn't have enough in theirs, the struggle continues. And so for me personally, from an industry perspective, from an organizational perspective, I have a unique responsibility to really lean into this moment and make some demands of our industry, make some demands of our organization. And I think too often folks of color will, sometimes just be happy to be at the table. And I think that is unacceptable. I think we have to look internally and understand the responsibility we have to bring others in the tent. And this is not a moment to be silent as folks of color. We got to really lean forward and demand more. So within our industry, I am doing just that. And I can tell you there's some organizations that naturally want to do the right thing, and there's others not so much. And so, again, from my perspective, I'm going to make them as mad as I need to make them until we make some significant change. This is the only time I see in my career to make it happen, and I'm willing to lay it all on the line. And I think we have to be willing to lay it all on the line. And this is not just about us in terms of our generation, but it's about future generations. And if millennials can be in the street, demanding more in the street, we have to demand more in the suite, and that's our responsibility.
And Diane, I would just piggyback on that if your board only has one person of color and one woman, yeah, it's going to be hard for them to push against that majority board. And that's why numbers matter, and why having a proportionate numbers of your board be representative, of people of color, of women. It makes it a better place for that board to have those real conversations. And I think there's plenty of data that show that those boards yield better business results. But I think it's hard to speak up if you're the one woman on the board or the one African-American, but if you're one of many, then obviously it's, I think, a little easier.
I think that's such an important point, though, Laura, that we hope we can share with businesses across this region in terms of it really is a win-win, bottom line, in terms of that, and the numbers prove that, the data show that. This is time now, as Thomas indicated, to lean in terms of whether it's directly in terms of access to the boardroom, but lots of the industries have associations, have an opportunity to bring other voices to bear into those boardrooms in terms of that. And so how do we make use of that? But I would want to expand this conversation a little bit further to say, at this particular time, for workers of color, for those essential workers that are largely Black workers and workers of color, in terms of how do we use white allies, in terms of this cannot be a battle in terms of making a difference in terms of changing these economic outcomes, because let's be clear, we're talking about the economic outcomes. That how do we use white allies in this space to move this conversation further to benefit the essential workers that are Black workers and workers of color? Laura Geissler, how do we use white allies?
Well, I tell you, I've recently sat on a couple of webinars such as this one over the last month or so, really learning a little bit more about how to be a white ally and how to lean in and to help Black people and other people of color as we all want to move to a state of inclusion and equity. We are beyond diversity. I mean, in the healthcare system, we have diversity. There's no doubt about that. But how do we take it to that more inclusive and more equitable state that it needs to be? So I think you know, we have some trainings, we have things available to us to, like I said, help us learn to be white allies. And I do think, you know, having conversations with our colleagues and leaning into topics and conversation that can be uncomfortable on both sides of that conversation, and just reaching across, you know, hands across, and having conversations with your team members, your bosses, your peers and colleagues, and executives when you get the opportunity to, about structural racism, the fact that it exists, white privilege exists. How do we help each other move forward from this place is I think the best way to go about leaning on each other, leaning in and leaning on each other during these times.
Thank you. The question I want to go back to, particularly, again, the focus of the Black workers of color in terms of the impact of COVID-19 and post, in terms of their workers that may be a part of our audience today, that even as we play this tape on our website after this is over, what do you see as industries or jobs or careers that may not recover post COVID-19? And where do you think that future opportunity might lie?
So from a hospitality perspective, a hotel perspective, I think that technology is going to be urgently introduced to our industry, and that customers are going to be looking for almost a touchless experience, being able to check in on their cell phones, being able to order food in restaurants by way of digital menus online without having to see a print menu, in some cases ordering before they arrive. So I think there's going to be more technology integrated into our business. The reason why I think our industry is uniquely positioned is because we're still in the hospitality business, and so there's still going to be a need for people, and it's still about relationships. And so I think there'll be some additional positions created on the technology side. There'll be a few less positions on the direct service side, but you know, the opportunities will still be there, just might look and feel a little bit different. And I think millennials, again, will be uniquely positioned to take advantage of the jobs on the technology side, just because they have a native intelligence around technology. Some of those in my generation and prior generations understand technology as well. But again, millennials, it's just, they've grown up with it. They have a unique advantage in many cases.
Anyone else?
I would just say that, you know, technology has been impacting financial services for quite some time in terms of the transactions that people used to come in and do over the teller window have been gravitating to technological means now for, you know, the last, you know, 10 years, but it's really accelerated. Just in the first 6 months of this year, we've seen a 30% increase in the use of technology. Now, will some of that shift back? Maybe, but I kind of think that Pandora's box is really open, and as people have discovered the convenience of it, I don't expect it. We will always need people in our business because there are things you want to talk to someone about. I think the question will be how much face-to-face type contact there will be. And I think we'll see a little bit less of that and more outreach over the phone. And that's a little bit of a skill change for folks who are used to interacting face to face. But I don't think it's going to have a huge impact. We will always need people who are able to deal with customers interpersonally. There may be slightly fewer of them, but those jobs will continue to exist.
Thank you. Someone also raised this issue regarding that point in terms of the technology component. And so we also know, and obviously it's, let me take a short pause to say thank you to Digital Harbor Foundation, who is our tech support for this webinar and has been our tech support and been a strong advocate around this issue of the digital divide. And so that's also where clearly structural racialized reality of our world shows up. in terms of the issue of access, in terms of the whole digital divide that exists in our country, in terms of the haves and have-not that turn out to be very much along the same line of race. And so with that being the reality for the future for many of the industries, are you in fact, I don't think you may have said this, Laura, in terms of, are you in fact doing anything in your particular industry and helping those workers in terms of help to get better access to use technology differently? That becomes one of those skill sets in terms of helping to pay attention to that upward mobility, the point you added earlier, Thomas, about mobility and upward mobility. If technology is part of that future, are we doing something to help our workers, those essential workers, be able to access those skill sets and access those tools that will help them in that upward mobility? Because what we've got to remember is that a degree is not always the answer, and that workers without a degree, we've proven this in terms of data, given the additional training that can actually move up. So are you all investing in the technology knowledge base and closing that divide for your workers at all?
So I would say for us, we have in recent years had computers set up in our break rooms of some of our hotels, and we've offered computer training on weekends and evenings to try to create an opportunity for our associates to learn, most of which are associates of color. We even had these iPads that we used to allow for them to take home to really further advance their understanding of technology to help address this. One other opportunity, I think, is I know that there's a conversation being had around either defunding or reprioritizing the spending of police. I would like to see some of those resources redeployed to really address the digital divide that exists in urban centers in this country, Baltimore City in particular. And so I think police departments are well funded. We should be able to find some resources to really address this particular opportunity.
Anyone else investing in technology? Is that something that you think the corporations, business owners ought to invest in for your workers, in particular the workers on the low end, that essential worker?
I would say that, you know, the barrier for using our technology internally is pretty low because it tends to not be, you know, highly technical beyond what people already use their phones for. So I think there's a low barrier for our employees now, whether they have access, you know, in their home beyond a phone. You know, we could probably do more to make access to computers and iPads and things outside of the office. We could probably do more on that. I don't know that it's something we've looked at, because I think we've generally tried to make our technology easier for people to manipulate, you know, not make it very hard for people to use. And I don't know that we've focused as much on access. I think it's a good point.
Thanks.
Especially for the older worker. I mean, for the older worker who's not technically savvy or doesn't have access, we found that some of our older workers are struggling with technology, you know, and we're trying to, you know, bring them up to speed and gradually and slowly teach them how, you know, this is the way of the future. And they're going to have to get on board if they want to be a part of the new wave.
So it's more, Geissler?
Yeah, I was just going to say in healthcare, yes, we're definitely investing in technology. And just to give you all a little bit of perspective, I know you may have seen us in the news because our telehealth team just like exploded during the beginning of all of this. In the month of February, we had maybe 2 visits via telehealth a day, okay? We're up over 900 a day right now, okay? That's just unbelievable. So that's how we're tending to do business with patients, right? So obviously it's going to impact our workforce. And I know our IT team is really looking at how do we realign kind of our infrastructure and to be able to support all of our workers around this. I will say, you know, like many of you have mentioned that you had space in your work areas. We had them in the hospitals, training rooms and computer rooms so that people and shared spaces where people could go and use computers. You know, the infection prevention component of that and the safety around cleaning those machines in between use and things of that nature has taken on a different level, obviously, as well in the healthcare space and really in all of your spaces, right? So it's figuring that out. I know we've made some investment in actual software, which has been great because we can now do it on the phone here, right? So we have like Office 365 that you can download to your smartphone and or iPad. It's getting people access to those items if they don't have it, and maybe it's using your purchasing power as an organization to kind of figure out how do we do that and then deploy those. I mean, I get a discount because, you know, through the company we've arranged things with Sprint and AT&T and Verizon. But how do we get the devices to people, I think is going to be an interesting component of purchasing power and trying to do that. Obviously then training, how do you train people? You know, and there's not a lot of training out there, frankly. You get this thing and you have to learn to play with it, and it scares people. So some people more than others. So, but I definitely think it's technology is most definitely on the rise, and we all do have to figure it out as individual organizations and industries of how we're gonna make this shift and make sure everybody's included in it. So it's a great point, because there is still very much a digital divide. I don't know if any of you saw, one of the things I saw a school system was doing is they actually brought a bus into a town where they didn't have a lot of Wi-Fi capability, and the bus had like a hotspot in it so that kids through local school systems could connect to Wi-Fi and to the internet to do their school lessons and things like that. As we've moved, obviously, the education teams have moved to doing digital and technology training, but access to Wi-Fi was an issue in that particular town, and that's how, you know, people got innovative, and that's how they decided to go at it. So I think you're going to see a lot more ingenuity and innovation around how do we solve this problem.
Diane, just one thing I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up. In DC, we have 500 kids learning about the hotel business from operations to ownership, with a whole lot of technology integrated into it. In Baltimore City, there's NAF High School with an emphasis on hospitality and culinary arts. In Baltimore City, there's an opportunity to strengthen that program, of which we're gonna really engage and look to really bring some additional industry partners to bear around it. But I think we also have to invest at the high school level to make certain that we're introducing young people of color to the technology that exists within our industry. And hopefully at this moment, we can, you know, take advantage of industry partners to set some resources aside for scholarships. We've been successful in DC. We got some work to do in Baltimore in that regard.
I agree.
Thank you. There's a number of programs that are in Baltimore, and again, maybe that, I'll say to Dara, maybe that's the next S.O.S. webinar in terms of around the whole technology issue in terms of here. But I love Thomas's point he raised earlier in terms of that in the hotel industry, you were actually making the laptop computers available in terms of in the, I guess, in the break room. And Laura's point in terms of kind of a low threshold in terms of technology. Laura, your point around technology in terms of the healthcare, and Jimmy, the older worker. I guess the question, because technology is such an important part, whether it's a low level, but it's an important part in terms of upward mobility, in terms of period, in terms of that. So how do we make technology in helping people learn technology, use technology available, perhaps providing them time out of the workplace where they can get some training on technology? Maybe it's not employer paid for, maybe recognizing that's an important part of that upward mobility is linking them to those technology learning opportunities. And I'm not sure that we think about that as an employer in terms of it really will benefit us as our employees get greater knowledge in terms of whatever level they're at. How do we make use of that? And is that something that our current business community could consider from your perspective?
Yes, 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 and yes. I think that, you know, clearly we're doing it in terms of iPads, laptops, trying to, give them access. And I would also say that sometimes we just need to let our folks know, if you're working in housekeeping, but you have an interest in front desk or sales, sometimes we just need to create an opportunity for them to come spend 3 or 4 hours in a different vertical, such that they can be exposed to technology in that vertical. And I would say industries and organizations aren't always good at communicating that that opportunity exists. And if we can be more public about letting folks know that they have a chance to come and just learn within the workplace at different points, I think that too can fill an important void, because again, we just don't always let folks know how they can learn.
Yeah, I would agree. And one of the things we started last year were what we call career mobility nights, where we went out to the various parts of our region with people who represented multiple career disciplines within the company, and had people come talk to them, spend time with them, understand what they do day to day, to get a better view of these jobs, which they may not run across in their workday. And it gave them an opportunity to see and make a contact with someone, but also to hear more about what do they do, and is that something I'd like to do. From a learning perspective, our learning platform is very technological, and you have you can access it inside or outside of the company, and it's broken down. A lot of the classes are broken down into short video and other other types of sort of learning bites, as one of the ways we're trying to make it more appealing and more accessible to people, because people don't have like 3 hours to sit down on an online class, but they might have 15 minutes to watch a video about either a technology or skill that they're interested in. So trying to make it accessible in terms of time commitment is another way.
Yeah.
Laura, I'm going to follow up on the career mobility night. Are there other ways that PNC is investing in upward mobility for your workers?
Well, yeah, I mean, we spend a lot of time and energy on development plans for every employee, so not only do you sit down and discuss performance once a year, but you sit down with the employee and say, do you like what you're doing? Would you like to do something else in the company? What are your aspirations? Let's map it out. Let's figure out how to get you from point A to point B, because it's generally not an issue of people not being, ambitious or having desires to move up. It's just knowing exactly what they need to do that. And we're trying to take the mystery out of that for people. And we've continued the career mobility into a virtual session. We're having one tomorrow night, because obviously we can't go out and people can't come in, but we've adapted it for technology as well.
So Laura, Geissler, I'm sorry, because I stopped you. You want to go forward?
Oh, I just was going to say, in addition to what Laura said, that micro lessons really have become kind of the future of training in general, for leaders as well as other team members in the organization. I also just wanted to say that LifeBridge has for many years had a workforce development team that's really dedicated. They have career coaches on there and programming. It's dedicated to those employees that make less than $20 an hour in the organization. And we partner with Baltimore Alliance for Careers in Healthcare and other groups throughout the state to continue to kind of help make sure that there is a path for employees and their support around that. And like I said, when someone starts with the organization, a career coach actually comes to those departments that may have folks that make less than $20 an hour, and offer services, and from really day one and at orientation to let them know what is available for them as far as career progression.
Thank you. So I heard a lot in terms of what a number of you are doing in terms of in your workplace, in terms of supporting that essential worker, particularly what we know by the data, are largely Black workers and workers of color, whether it's around opportunity for paying attention to upward mobility, looking at policies, looking at the technology, because that can be an opportunity for them in terms of a pathway, in terms of paying attention, reconfiguring jobs in terms of that. But I have a tougher question for you guys. What are you not doing? What are you not doing in terms of, so if I were to ask an employee, an essential worker in one of your companies, a Black worker, worker of color, what will they say that they don't feel like is happening that could make a difference, because you may have a blind spot around some of the challenges they have as workers of color? What might they say?
I can take a stab at that. I think that some of our white colleagues have the benefit of either multi-generational mentorship or networking circles that help to advance their knowledge, exposure, and understanding in an area of business. I would say for our associates of color, there's not enough of that happening. And so if you're in a hotel, you may think the ultimate job for you might be to be a general manager, absent understanding positions at the corporate office and or on the ownership level. And so I think that it's exposing our associates to the highest levels of our business, introducing them and advancing their knowledge of is something that's not happening enough.
I would say that too, Thomas. I would just, I think mentoring, we of course, people are often assigned a preceptor, if you will, as someone starts the organization. And I just mentioned the career coach component. But I do think mentoring is a huge piece. And actually, it's something that on our kind of culture roadmap is going to probably fall to me and a few of my colleagues to figure that out in the next year or two as I look at our culture roadmap. So it's definitely something on our radar, and it is something I think that we are investing in and we could be doing a better job of. So I think we would hear that from employees as well.
Laura Campbell?
Yeah, I would echo what Laura and Thomas have said. I would also say that one of the things we hear frequently is, we don't see people of color in higher levels of the company, and my colleagues of color who are at mid and high levels in the company, we kind of look at ourselves and go, why don't they see the connection? And why aren't these positions and these people in these positions more visible to them? So how do we make it, how do we engage our executives of color, especially with these individuals, to let them see these folks in these positions, and also from a mentoring perspective? So we sometimes shake our heads and we're like, what do you mean? But there's something missing here, and we have to do a better job of highlighting folks of color in these roles so that they are more accessible to the folks in the lower levels of the organization.
For me,
Jimmy, yes, please.
Well, for me, when I started my business over 30 years ago, my primary purpose was because I didn't see anyone in an executive position that looked like me. There were no Black executive chefs. There were no Black executive managers. We were just workers. And I vowed that I would make a difference. And for me, when I started this company, and it had nothing to do with being racist, I just wanted to see companies like myself be in a better position to do business, not as joint ventures, not as minority businesses, but as good businesses. And the plus was we're Black. So in my company, there's a Black executive in every level, from the accounting to the law department to the sales executives. And I'm proud to be a part of that. And I just encourage all businesses, just give us a chance, and certainly we'll prove that we have the ability.
So thank you all. We're nearing the end of our time. I want to begin to open it up to see if our audience has any questions for any of our panelists. But I want to also, in terms of just as a part of this, in terms of talking about everything that you shared from the last conversation, in terms of mentoring, in terms of exposure to leadership in the company that is of color, in terms of Black or persons of color, is the need for intentionality. In terms of how are we doing that in an intentional way, in terms of so it becomes just a course of business, in terms of ensuring that that opportunity is there. ABC does a volunteer career mentoring program in terms of helping workers that are first starting off in terms of that employment pathway. In terms of that, and the goal of that is also helping them understand there's a career in terms of a pathway, in terms of that, and connecting to relationships, because Thomas's earlier point about access, in terms of the nature of structural racism, the nature of all kinds of racism in this country has led us to limited in terms of social capital that's available, that all of you on this participating today in terms of panelists know my statement that I make often in terms of I'm going to find new language for it, but that Black people, people of color are not broken. They don't need to be fixed in terms of the opportunities and making that a reality, and where systems actually serve to curtail that upward mobility is where we need to go deeper in terms of analyzing those systems and policies and then doing something different in that place. And so I want to go into the questions and see what we have from our audience. I know that we have several, but one I want to give to you, and that is, this time next year, what's going to be different from each other panelists in your particular organization? What's going to be different in this whole conversation? Lots of things you're talking about, you want to see happen, things you're doing in terms of, so if this set of participants become your accountability partners, ABC is your accountability partner, a year from now, what are we going to see different?
I guess I can start. I think organizationally, we're the most diverse of any hotel management company, at least in this region, in that we're majority minority, majority women. But that's not enough. I think what I want to see is us doing more to reach our associates of color. So we're starting initiative specifically to target, it's a diversity initiative targeting our associates of color, of which we're going to have sessions on a monthly basis covering various subjects. So I think we'll have advanced with that initiative, and we'll have made some adjustments based upon learnings. I also think that we will have had more diversity on industry boards. Chris Nassetta, President and CEO of Hilton, recently put out that he is going to appoint an African-American to the board of Hilton. That's a new development. I think we're going to see more African-Americans sitting on brand boards. I think we're going to see more African-Americans sitting on public hotel company boards. I think we're going to see more individuals of color in senior leadership positions. The last time our industry made a catastrophic change was when the NAACP issued the report card back in the early 2000s, of which it gave a grade to the industry. I think this is another moment similar to that, and that basically the entire industry is going to basically make some structural changes based upon these times. And so I think you're going to be able to see some tangible changes. For me, it's just about not resting on our laurels. Once we get those changes, we have to continue to put forward demands for even more. There's a great deal of work still yet to be done, but I think we'll be further along a year from now.
Laura, Geissler, what do you
yeah, that's if all of what Thomas said happened, I would be psyched. I would really say that I hope we see a continued united front for equity. I want to see that continue and continue to strengthen. At LifeBridge, I hope that I see a new inclusion and equity strategy for the organization. and with a lot of input from executive leadership as well as frontline team members as well too. And I know that that is on a path that we are going into. This would somewhat augment and/or, I don't like to use the word replace, but it would take our diversity and inclusion initiatives and strategy in a different place. So I want to see that shift away from D&I to inclusion and equity, and I know that that's going to happen. I also would like to see, as we discussed here today, greater technology access and skills for all. So those are kind of the three things that I'd like to see be different this time next year.
Okay.
I agree. I'd like to see more conversations with my team, having conversations with maybe partnering with mentors, as Thomas talked about earlier, so that they can have the knowledge and the access, not just to have the conversation internally, but externally, and find out how we can do better as a company and what we need to do better as bosses and owners, and then include our conversation along with their conversation to see what results we can do as we try to improve.
Laura?
Yeah, I'd like to see continuing conversations of dismantling structural barriers, both within corporations, within our company, continuing to peel back, the layers of, why do we, struggle to retain and promote people of color? What are we doing? And obviously the way you gauge the improvement is the numbers and, seeing more progress there. And in our communities, a greater understanding, knowledge of structural racism and the barriers that are very intertwined in all of our institutions and our systems as in the state and in the city, and what can we do to continue to dismantle those.
Thank you all. I want to give you opportunity in terms of if there's anything you want to make as a closing statement. I know we had a couple of questions. I will say one of our panelists had questions about the space around public policy and what kind of legal legislative work needs to be done to ensure equity and inclusion. I'm pleased to say that to that participant, our audience participant, look forward to our next S.O.S webinar. That is what we will be talking about in terms of public policy in terms of this space. But to each of you, if there's anything you would like to say in closing, I want to again thank you that what we look to see, and we will be your accountability partners in terms of a year from now as we continue to partner throughout the year, is we want to see that because we want to see, in fact, the upward mobility in terms of for Black workers and workers of color, and being able to remove those racialized barriers that are embedded that oftentimes are invisible in terms of through many of that. So that there, in fact, we're on our way to a more viable economic environment here in Baltimore and the region. For us, that is what the importance of this conversation is about in terms of how do we get through lots of those structural racialized issues inside of our workforce ecosystem to move the needle for Black workers and workers of color. Because the end result, it creates a win-win for absolutely everyone. And you can find on our website our different tools in terms of 10 essential questions for racial equity policy development, as well as one for employers. But again, I want to thank you all, but I want to stop and give you each a chance to make a closing statement.
I'd just like to thank you, Diane. Thank all the panelists. Look forward to meeting you to have further discussions and to be a part of the solution, not a part of the problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
So Diane, I would just say that this is a defining time in Baltimore City's history. It's a defining time in our nation's history. I think we all have a critical role to play. And I'm cautiously optimistic, not because of my own thoughts, but I'm cautiously optimistic because of the demands I see being imposed by young people. I think a year from now, we're not going to be at the finish line. I just think we're going to be in the game a year from now. Mm-hmm. And I think that we just got to continue to build and build and build and build and build. And I think that as long as we stay connected, continue to have conversations, not just with words, but with actions, again, we'll be further down the road. But this is an ongoing struggle. There's a quote that says, each generation has a responsibility to weaken the chain of structural racism. And while not one generation will break the chain, if each generation does its part to weaken one link, at some point the chain will break. And so we got to lean into this moment to weaken as many links in the chain as we can, and hopefully we can break the entire chain. But if all of us lean forward, we'll definitely be further along 1 year from now.
Thank you. Laura Gamble?
Okay. I don't know that Thomas's point was just made so beautifully. I think, we have a responsibility to continue to push. And as white leaders, we have a responsibility to call out those who aren't getting it and not let this opportunity pass to help educate everyone. And I also would say that, there's a time for words, but there's a time for action. And I want to make sure that we don't miss the opportunity to go from word to action at this moment.
Thank you. Laura Geissler?
So as the healthcare person on the panel here, I want to take a moment to remind us all that I hope that we will all continue to be mindful that we are not clear of this virus and this pandemic, and to please take precautions for yourselves, all of you that are listening and all of you on the panel here, for yourselves and your families, to stay safe and really avoid a resurgence of cases. And then I also would just say that, let's all be each other's allies and accountability partners, because Black Lives Matter.
Thank you very much. Thank you all. Before I close out, Thomas, there's a request for the source for that quote.
So I'll have to get the source, Diane, to you, because in essence, I have a historical mentor who was a founding member of the OAU back in the 60s. And he gives me an abundance of quotes, and I try to remember the words more so than who said it.
Thank you.
And so I'll get that for you.
We'll share it with our audience. I want to thank again Digital Harbor Foundation for their support in terms of make this, but I would be absolutely remiss without thanking one of ABC's team members, and this is her body of work, in terms of Adara Yara, in terms of putting this together, in terms of moving this agenda and this needle forward, in terms of that. And so thank you, Adara, in terms of your work, in terms of putting this together and continue to move this work forward. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you all for our participants for joining us today. We will be able to place the webinar on our website. I believe we will, Kenny, last time from Digital Harbor, I think it will take us like 24 hours, 48 hours. It will be available for those of you that want to look the webinar again, or those that were not able to join us. And I've got a commitment that I will be inviting you each back 1 year from now as your accountability partner to talk about what happens post-COVID-19. Thank you again, all. Thank you very much. And thank you, PNC, for the support for this event. I would be remiss without saying thank you. PNC is a part of support in terms of sponsor for us to do that. PNC has been great in terms of moving this forward and working as a partner with us in lots of different ways. So thank you, Laura, for that support. And obviously Chris Rocky, who is from PNC and on our board. So I'm going to give Chris a shout out in terms of that.
Thanks,
you all.
Diane.
Black Lives Matter, but it will be on our website in terms of 24 hours from now. I see I'm getting notification that that's when it will be available. Thank you. Have a very safe day to all.